In this lecture video, we're largely going to focus on Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics, his seminal work on what it means to rule and what politics actually is. So, Aristotle was a Greek ancient philosopher who lived roughly 384 to 322 BCE. He was a student of Plato's at the Academy, and he ended up going on to tutor Alexander the Great, for example. So he had direct connections to ruling and advising rulers. And the Politics is a really interesting text because it comes after his work, the Nicomachean Ethics, where the ethics, having established what the highest good is, eudaimonia, what the purpose of life is, and the Politics then kind of argues what then the framework is for making it possible to pursue a eudaimonia, to make it possible to complete one's life. Well, not just one's life, but humanity, the purpose of humanity, to flourish. At the same time, though, it's not just that the Politics, in a sense, comes afterwards, that ethics is more fundamental, and, the Politics might be applied ethics. But in many ways, then, the Politics also informs kind of the ways we might want to think about ethics and what it means to live a virtuous life and the differences between individuals and society according to how they can pursue virtuous lives. So Aristotle's theory of politics is very much then a virtue theory of politics. His theory of politics is also something that might have a lot to say about today's society and how, maybe if we think politics is failing in some regard or another, or what the point of it all is anyways, that we might learn from. Now, perhaps not so much the slavery and sexism aspects of Aristotle's political theory, but perhaps, as we'll see, his idea of politics as an organic growth, as the purpose of politics is to enable the flourishing of human lives. So, we can start with a very basic question, as I was just alluding to. What is politics? Is politics a common power that maybe overawes us? Something like Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, right? That politics is about power. It's about order. It's about security. Such that, why maybe someone like Thomas Hobbes might justify an all-powerful sovereign is that, well, the all-powerful sovereign is someone that is going to be sublime and therefore keep us in check. We're not going to try and challenge power, challenge authority, and that is what is going to allow there to be a stable and secure society, such that then we can, pursue whatever desires we have, as long as we don't violate law. It'll be something similar, maybe, that someone like the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, political realists in general might say about what politics really is. Another theory of what politics is, well, it might just really be a tool for purpose beyond itself. And maybe that seems like, at least on a surface level, what we might think Aristotle's theory of politics is. That, well, if the point of life is to flourish, politics then is what enables us to pursue flourishing lives. Politics then would be a means to an end. And in a way, it is a means to an end, without a doubt. But politics isn't simply applied ethics, as other political philosophers might think it to be, maybe such like John Rawls or G.A. Cohen, maybe even other utilitarian thinkers as well, where really you develop then kind of what a theory of justice is, what a theory of liberty is, what a theory of rights is, and so on, and then you just figure out how to actually implement it. And the figuring out how to implement it is what politics is. So really what's fundamental then, at least normatively speaking, is, the work of ethics. But that's not quite how Aristotle sees politics. Maybe politics is a science based on clear and distinct things that have their roots in our perceptive faculties. So this could be, on the one hand, a more rationalistic account of politics, a science. Maybe in many ways this is what political scientists think of what politics is, which is why they're so focused on models and trying to predict human behaviors as such to then, be effective in making possible or predicting outcomes, or even making possible the kinds of outcomes that politicians might want. It also might be the conception of politics that utilitarians might have as well, with being a tool for a purpose beyond itself, because they might think, well, politics then can be a science such that we figure out how to maximize happiness, and we simply just, politics would be the implementation of laws or institutions that enable the maximization of happiness and pleasure. Aristotle is going to disagree with all these conceptions of politics and really think politics is connected to what it means to be a human being. That as human beings, we are animate, and therefore politics we should think of as an organic growth. And he says, Joe Sachs, the translator of, one of the translators of the Politics, the one that I'm using for this lecture video, he actually says, in trying to explain how Aristotle approaches thinking about politics as what it means to be a human being, as an animate being, a being that is involved in growth and decay. And Joe Sachs says that the most natural beginning of politics is always the living human being already in real life. Being in a household, being a son or a father, a wife or a mother, not a fragmented being reduced to his perceptive faculties and placed in an imaginary state of nature. So we shouldn't think of politics then as kind of, a collection of individuals which have their own interests, and we just try to keep each other from killing themselves with their own interests, or even think of politics as a matter of, agents, right? These abstract things. But politics is associated with, it is involved, it is a part of what it means to live in a house, live in a community, be a laborer, be a mother, father, and so on. We ought to then think of, in answering the question, what is politics? Well, why does politics arise? What gives cause to politics? So, in looking for the purpose of politics, we can begin with, since politics is about human beings, Aristotle's definition of what it means, or what a soul is of a human being. That all living things are for their own sake, their own kind of preservation. That living things are a combination of completeness and activity. That at the same time we are, in other words, a being at work staying itself, right? A tree seeks to preserve itself through, roots spreading out, trying to find water, photosynthesis. There's a reason why it has leaves that, fall and then sprouts new ones and so on, right? All these things are a way in which the tree continues on living, sustaining itself. Human beings are no different. Human beings are a being at work staying itself. That we are, at base, really seeking how to continue staying alive, staying in the state of being. And that is not just in a static sense of being alive, such that it's like a light switch, in which you turn it on, and you turn the light switch off, and it's off, which even then, right, that requires a constant surge of energy and so on. But it also involves activity, constant activity. Human beings, however, there's a reason why politics exists for human beings, and politics doesn't exist for other kinds of animals. So we might want to ask then, why is a human, more than any other animal, meant for a city? Why don't we see, cats living in cities? Now, of course, they do live in cities, but they live in human cities. Why aren't there cat cities? Why aren't there bird cities? Yeah, there might be a collection of, a herd or something like that, where we talk about animals grouped together. But we really see that this is a kind of instinct. There isn't the kind of messiness and maybe disagreement and search for justification, issues of freedom, that arise with politics as it relates to human beings. We don't see that in animals. So in answering why, then, a human, more than any other animal, is meant for a city, Aristotle says, why a human being is an animal meant for a city more than any other sort of bee and every other sort of herd animal is clear. For nature, as we claim, does nothing uselessly, and a human being, alone among the animals, has speech. So first off, speech, this ability to reason, logos, to give justification, to articulate things. And while the voice is a sign of pain and pleasure, and belongs also to the other animals on that account, since their nature goes this far to having a perception of pain and pleasure and communicating these to one another, speech is for disclosing what is advantageous and what is harmful, and so too what is just and what is unjust. For this is distinctive of human beings in relation to the other animals, to be alone and having a perception of good and bad, just and unjust, and the rest. And it is an association involving these things that makes a household and a city. And a city is more primary by nature than a household, and more primary than each of us, for the whole is necessary, more primary than its parts. Even though we might say a household comes before an association comes before a city, at least causally. For if the whole is done away with, there will be not a foot or a hand except in an ambiguous sense, as if one were to speak of a hand made of stone. For once it has been disabled, it will be like that. But all things are defined by their work and potency. So when they are no longer of the sort defined, they cannot be called the same things except ambiguously. So it is clear both that the city is by nature, and that it is more primary than each person. For if each person is not self-sufficient when separate, he will be in a condition similar to that of other parts in relation to the whole. And one who is no part of a city, either from lacking the power to be in association, or from needing nothing on account of self-sufficiency, is for that reason either a beast or a god. Either they have no need for a city because they are incapable of achieving the kinds of things that human beings are capable of achieving, involving a kind of a flourishing, not just of character, but the intellectual virtues as well, or a god, and that, well, there's no need for a city because, if a god, I'm all powerful, all wise, and so on. I don't need the city to help complete me. So this brings us to Aristotle's political naturalism, his account of why then politics is natural to human beings. The first reason, or the first premise really in this argument, is that human beings exist with nature. So of course we have certain kinds of desires to stay away from pain, to pursue pleasure, but we don't just seek a pleasure, right? It's really about self-preservation, right? So when it's storming outside, maybe we try to go into shelter. When it's nice and sunny, we want to go and find good places to pick berries and so on for sustenance. We want to find mates to procreate and so on, right? Now the second premise then is that because of these natures, well, households arise, right? Because with a household, you have a husband or a wife such that you can procreate. Of course, more people than, whether it's just 2 people or with children, as historically was the case, you wanted a lot of children, not just because many of them died very young, but because the more children you have, the more work that can be done to help sustain the household. So the household then is kind of the smallest association possible, and it's organized in accord with nature for everyday life. The village then arises when several households combine. So in this sense then, the village is the first kind of association that's composed of more than one household that does not serve the purposes of a daily sort, because the village can plan longer term, right? And the village can have, maybe a certain kind of council that says, look, a couple of you are going to be, hunters and gatherers. A couple of you are going to have maybe, something like, think of a neighborhood, right? And you have someone who's, the HOA, like the president of the HOA, the treasurer, things like that, right? And that's kind of looking long-term to the preservation of the neighborhood that doesn't have the daily tasks that each person has with, rising, keeping the house clean, having food, cooking, and all that stuff. Villages, though, they're still too small to enable the kind of structure or framework necessary for living a complete life. This is where the city comes into play. The city is the complete association made of more than one village. And Aristotle says, the city gets to the threshold of full self-sufficiency, coming into being for the sake of living, but being for the sake of living as well. Hence, every city is by nature, if in fact the first forms of association are as well, and that for the sake of which the end is also what is best, and self-sufficiency is both an end and what is best. From these things, then, it is plain that the city is one of the things that are by nature, and that a human being is by nature an animal meant for a city, or, in a different translation, a political animal. So the city is both prior to the household, and yet it is the conclusion, the natural conclusion, tendency of a household. It is then the purpose, right? Speaking teleologically here. So to find out what kind of a rule is fit for a city, Aristotle says there are four kinds of rule that we have to distinguish. And first, to investigate, and then ultimately to explain why they are not the same kind of political rule that we see in a city. So we have rule as wealth management, the kind of rule of a master over a slave, the rule of a husband over a wife, and the rule of a father over children. So of course, some of these questions, rule of a master over a slave, or talking about rule of a husband over a wife, this we're going to be looking at arguments in favor of slavery and sexism. So we want to kind of keep some things in mind. That one, it's just good to know historically, right? If we want to know about Aristotle and his theory, why he made these arguments, what his rationale was. We want to also know, though, to what extent we can, if possible, preserve his political theory without, keeping the slavery and the sexism, if possible at all. So that would be another reason why we want to know what his arguments are, to see to what extent they're necessary for his more general theory of politics and whether they can be cast aside. Nonetheless, it's important to ask them, is there any kind of a difference in when we talk about how a father rules over children, or someone involved in wealth management, like a capitalist, a boss, someone like that, right? Like, is that the same, the way in which they rule over money, or they have this authority over financial transactions and so on, right? Is that the same kind of rule? And I think there is, in a way, a timely question, especially with the father over children. The other day I saw a tweet, or I guess a post on X or Twitter by the conservative commentator Matt Walsh, where he was talking about how, the supposed reason that's not a reason that parents give children, because I said so, and the child says, why do I have to do blah, blah, blah? And Matt Walsh was saying that's the only kind of a reason you have to give, because I said so, because the parent has to have authority over the child. And it was interesting because the way that Matt Walsh in this tweet spoke about authority really sounded, at least the justification he gave, were the same kinds of justification that you would give for why a political ruler needs authority. And we're going to see here, I'm going to read from Aristotle, why actually there is a difference between the kind of authority that a father would have over children versus the kind of authority that a political ruler would have over their subjects or citizens. Okay, let me get to this quote. Okay, so the question is the difference between a political ruler, the head of a family, a boss over a worker, or a master over a slave just a matter of degree, with the form ultimately remaining the same? Is a large household no different than a small city? So would we basically say there's a qualitative difference or a quantitative? Such that, well, look, political rule, someone that rules over a city, over a state, it's just a matter of having more subjects as compared to a family, with the parent ruling over the children. But Aristotle is going to argue that is not the case. There is an important difference. He says, "It is also clear from these things that mastery of slaves and political rule are not the same, and that all forms of rule are not the same as one another, as some claim. For one sort is over people free by nature, and the other over slaves." So that would be, as we'll see, political rule is over people free by nature, as compared to those who rule over slaves. Also, household management is a monarchy, since every household is ruled by one person. Back in the day, right, the male, the father. While political rule is over people who are free and equal. So this is just going to give us a little taste as to why political rule is different from rule as wealth management, or the kind of rule that a parent would have over their children, and so on. The full answer we're not going to get until we explore more of the politics as a whole. But for the rest of this video lecture, we're going to look at these different kinds of rule and what actually is the nature of those kinds of rule, to see then later on how political rule differs and what the nature of political rule really is. So rule as wealth management. So rule as wealth management, right? We're talking about money, we're talking about property. And Aristotle says that possession, so any kind of a possession, we can think of as an instrument for life. It is, something that has a use value, so to speak, right? A toothbrush is a possession that is an instrument for life because it is meant to preserve the health of the teeth. Property, however, is an assortment of instruments for Aristotle. It is not just something that has use value, but it has something beyond that self, which is, growing itself, and which is why later on in, classical economics, someone like Adam Smith distinguishes two different kinds of property as, something that has use value and something that has exchange value, although that's later than Aristotle, that clear distinction. Now, household management is not the same as provisioning, right? In that, yes, possession and property is part of a household, and households need to provision goods. They need to provision possessions. But the difference is that household management is involved in the using, right, of property for sustaining the household. Provisioning, though, is about providing. Provisioning is something by nature. It is something that is about trade, and then there's another kind of provisioning that is by skill, which is involved in the growth of profit. So we can think of then provisioning by nature. Why would trade be something natural, a kind of natural provisioning? Well, it's simply, going back to our base desires, back to an earlier slide where we talked about, I trade you, I need some meat, and yet I have a lot of, potatoes, corn, grains, things like that. So we trade, right? Because I need some protein, you need some carbs, right? That's a kind of basic, needing to immediately, or at least secondarily, fulfill these base desires and getting our sustenance to continue living. But provisioning by skill is different, because we're talking about not simply acquiring a property for the sake of my, sustaining my being. But we're talking about growing money, right? Increasing money for either a long-term view or for the sake of itself, as is the case with, capitalism didn't exist back then. But that is, what happens now in capitalism. It's the logic is the endless growth of profit. Money is the bottom line in capitalism. So Aristotle says, from the point at which a currency was provided out of necessary exchange, another form of provisioning came into being, the commercial sort. So the commercial sort is that by skill, right? It's something not natural, but takes skill, which people are better and worse at, which did originate out of the natural trade, where first you have bartering, and then you start using currency to trade. And once you start using currency to trade, you enable a new kind of provisioning by skill. And he says, of the commercial sort, at first probably in a simple way, then through experience already more a matter of art, about what items exchanged in what way will make the most profit. Just to think about this kind of provisioning by skill, we can think about the stock market, the way in which that some people are better at it, some people are worse. Bitcoin, do you invest in Bitcoin? What kinds? When do you, of course the saying is buy low and sell high, but right, there's skill involved in this thing. It is an art form. This is why Aristotle says, it seems that provisioning is especially concerned with the currency, and that its job is to be able to see where a greater amount of money will come from, since it is productive of wealth and money. That's very different from provisioning by nature, which is meant to provide for our most basic needs. Now, this does not mean then that provisioning by skill, so commerce, let's just say, this doesn't mean that commerce is unnecessary for a city. It doesn't mean then that the true city, the best city, would be one without commerce. Commerce is essential, according to Aristotle. But it does mean there is a kind of vice, there can be a kind of excess when it comes to commerce, when it comes to provisioning by skill. So I want to read here what Aristotle says about the vice of profiteering, when it becomes an excess. He says, with the sort of provisioning involved in household management, on the other hand, there is a limit, since this is not the job of household management. This is why, in one sense, it appears necessary for there to be a limit to all wealth. But in what happens, we see things turning out the opposite way. For all those who engage in provisioning increase their supply of currency to an unlimited extent. Skipping ahead a bit, and even those who devote themselves to living well seek what leads to bodily enjoyments. So this too appears to be available through property. All the time they spend is connected with money, and this is where the other form of provisioning comes from. For since there is enjoyment in extravagance, they seek what produces the extravagance that leads to enjoyment. And if they are incapable of providing this through provisioning, they attempt it through other sources, using each of their capacities in a way not in accord with its nature. For the nature of courage is not to make money, but to produce confidence. And the natures of military and medical skill are not to make money, but in the one case victory, in the other health. But some people, however, when they end up acting on this vice of excess of profiteering, some people turn all these into provisioning, as though this were their end, and everything had to press ahead to the end. Now, of course, when they do so, they end up living unethical lives, because they ultimately, by pursuing profit as the be-all and end-all, they end up actually preventing themselves from living a flourishing life, because they're unable to develop all the other kinds of virtues. So, in understanding wealth management, Aristotle says there are three forms of provisioning. The primary natural one is trade. The secondary one, which is commercial, is things like money lending and wage labor. So it's interesting as well here that wage labor actually isn't something natural. It's something that is developed by skill, something that is related to commerce. And then he says there's a mixed kind of provisioning that is neither, it's not that it comes last, it's not that it's the least important, but it's just a mix of the primary and secondary forms of provisioning, which would be the collection of raw materials. Because in some ways, the collection of raw materials, of course, is essential in order to have things to barter and to trade, right? That's what we're seeking, are those goods to meet our basic needs. At the same time, the collection of raw materials, depends a lot on the development of different skills for how to get those things. You're not able to collect oil and use it for something until you have technological development. And a lot of times, the kinds of raw materials that are needed for a city depend on wage labor, a mass amount of laborers. So that's why the third form is a mix of primary and secondary provisioning. Okay, so this is just the basic understanding of wealth management and what is involved in wealth management. Next, we have rule as master over slave. So having understood what a possession is and what property is, Aristotle says that a slave is animate property for the end of the master's household. So, a slave then is a kind of a tool for the sake of life, for the sake of the master's life. Now, you might wonder, how then could it be justified if we're saying, well, the slave, which is a human being, is something for the sake of the master's life? What about for the sake of the slave? And we will get there in a moment why Aristotle thinks that actually the slave benefits from being a slave as well. But to begin understanding why Aristotle justifies slavery, he first says, look, the mind naturally rules over the body, right? We have to admit, he says, that in the same way that it's not the hand that tells the brain what to do for the brain tells the hand what to do in grabbing, this book, looking for the correct page to find the quotation. So clearly then, the mind has a certain kind of authority over the body, okay? And we're going to see this distinguishing then between mental labor and manual labor, something that Marx, much later on, takes up and says, we have to abolish that distinction entirely. Okay, so he says, so as we are saying, the first place to get an insight into the rule of a master and political rule is an animal. For the soul rules over the body with the rule of a master, while intellect rules over desire with political or kingly rule. In these cases, it is evident that it is an advantageous thing, in accord with nature, for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the part that operates by feeling to be ruled by the intellect. The part that has reason, while an equal or reversed relation, is harmful to them all. And it is the same way again in the case of a human being and the other animals. The tame animals are better in nature than the wild ones, and it is better for them all to be ruled by a human being, since in that way they attain preservation. So then he's going to draw an analogy, and he says, in the same way that it is clearly better for both the mind and the body that the mind rule over the body as it does so naturally, the master then uses intellect to rule in the same way, telling people what to do, as the slave then is a body to labor. And it is for the benefit of the slave. So he says, the relation of male to female is by nature that of a superior and inferior, and ruler and ruled. So he's also relating this to why then he thinks the husband, or just men in general, right, have natural authority over women. Although he actually doesn't justify it as much as he justifies slavery. But he says, it is necessary that it be the same way in the case of all human beings. So those who stand as far removed as soul is from body or human being from a beast, and those for whom the use of the body is their work, and for whom this is the best that comes from them are situated in this way, are slaves by nature, and for them it is better that they be ruled by this sort of rule, if indeed it is better for the things that have been mentioned. For someone is by nature a slave if he is capable of belonging to another person, and hence also does belong to another person, and if he shares in reason only to the extent of perceiving it, but not of having it. For the other animals are subservient not to reason, but to feelings, and their usefulness is only slightly different, since assistance with necessities by means of the body comes from both, from slaves and from tame animals. And so, right, he's basically saying, look, there are some people just that are better at manual labor, and they're not good at kind of, planning out and calculating the kinds of things that might be, perhaps, let's say, involved in running a business, right? This is actually Aristotle's argument for why slavery is justified is actually similar to the argument given by capitalists as to why they are justified in kind of, owning the property, being the boss, because they have the kind of intellect that some people just lack. Which is why those people are better to be the wage laborers, where the CEO or the boss tells them what to do, and they perform those tasks. Now, of course, it's different, right? It's not saying, look, as a wage laborer, you are wholly owned by the boss. There is a difference. And in this case, Aristotle is saying that the slave, because they lack the full ability to use reason in the way that some people do possess reason and can use it properly, they therefore are justified in being an animate property to the master. Thus, some people are free, Aristotle says, and others slaves by nature, of which then it is advantageous for them to be so, in the same way that it is advantageous to the hand for it to be ruled by the mind, as opposed to the hand ruling itself or ruling over the mind, for which the hand has no ability to do so, and could not preserve itself. Okay. Let's then look at rule over wife and children, which Aristotle actually ends up combining in his analysis. So, neither being a husband nor being a father are akin to being a slave master because, well, the slave is wholly unfree. And Aristotle says, one rules a wife and children as free people in both cases, but not with the same manner of rule, but in a political manner, in the case of a wife, and a kingly manner, in the case of children. In the way that, look, in a political manner, you have a certain way in which the citizen is owed respect, but they still abide by the authority of, whoever is the ruler. Now, of course, in the case of a king, the king kind of has this sovereignty such that they can say, because I said so, right? Such that then the child has to obey. But the difference is the child eventually will be able to think for themselves and then will no longer be subject to the authority of their parent, or in this case for Aristotle, the father especially, because they've outgrown that lack of an ability to think for themselves and act as a free person. So notice the justification for why then a wife has to be subservient to the husband isn't as entirely clear. Aristotle in some passages will just say a woman isn't capable of, having the same kind of authority or just excelling in the same way that a man can. He never really gives a justification for that. This just seems to be his opinion. Nonetheless, we might ask, if it is the case that, not all men, because, there are men who would be slaves, but some men are fit to rule, others are fit to be citizens, some are fit to be slaves, and then the way in which you have the hierarchy and, father over a wife and then parent over child, it would seem then that you have different capacities and different ways in which they are categorized. Could you say then that virtue is attainable to all? Because it would seem that virtue would only be attainable to those men who are capable of ruling. Maybe not even those men who are capable of just being a citizen. Much less, of course, a slave who it doesn't seem like would be capable of attaining virtue at all if they're not even able to possess the kind of reason that is characterized by a slave master. So Aristotle is actually going to answer this and explain how, virtue is still attainable to all, but in different ways. So Aristotle says, it is clear then that it is necessary for both to participate in virtue, but for there to be differences in this, just as there are in those who naturally rule. And this leads straight to a consideration of the soul, for there is in it by nature something ruling and something ruled, of which we claim there are different virtues, as of the part having reason and the irrational part. So this gets to the tripartite conception of the soul, that can be studied in, his work on the soul or in the Nicomachean Ethics. It is evident then that things are the same way in other cases as well, so that most things are ruling or ruled by nature. For it is in different ways that the free rules the slave, the male the female, and the man the child, and while the parts of the soul are present in them all, they are present in differing ways. For the slave wholly lacks the deliberative capacity, while the female has it, but without authority. And I'll just read here Joe Sachs's explanation of when he says the female has deliberative capacity, but has it without authority. And Joe Sachs here says that Aristotle could mean the deliberative capacity in a woman is without force, either because it is by nature weaker in her than feelings, or because it is conventionally unrecognized and unrespected. So in one way, it could just be that, the female lacks authority simply because society doesn't recognize her as having authority. In that case, it would seem that there is no natural justification for the female being subservient to the male. But nonetheless, continuing, and the child then has that deliberative capacity, but it is incomplete. So, it must likewise be assumed that this necessarily holds for the virtues of character as well, that everyone needs to participate in them, but not in the same way. So there are different ways in which they can flourish, but what it means to flourish is different for each. So, but each to the extent that concerns his own work. Hence, the one who rules ought to have complete virtue of character, for work is the responsibility of the master craftsman in an unqualified way, and reason is a master craftsman, but each of the others as much as falls to his lot. So it is clear that ethical virtue belongs to all of those mentioned, and that moderation is not the same in a woman and a man, and neither are courage and justice in the way that Socrates supposed, but there is a courage appropriate to ruling, and another to being a subordinate, and it is similar with the other virtues. So basically, ruling and being ruled differ in kind, then, that we can see what it means in terms of the kinds of the kinds of excelling, that what it would mean to excel as a slave as compared to what it would mean to excel as a parent, as compared to what it would mean to excel as excel in wealth management, as compared to what it would mean to excel in political ruling. Confusion, then, Aristotle says, confusion arises when people, confusion is the heart, I should say, of political disorder. When some people think that, well, perhaps a good ruler is someone who is a good business person. In fact, this is something you'll hear a lot by certain kinds of people in American politics, that we need somebody who runs a business because since they know how to run a business, they would be a good politician. They would run the country well. And Aristotle is saying, no. Running a business, right, seeking profit, is a different kind of ruling than what is involved in political rule. And that is different from what is involved as ruling as a parent, and so on. Confusion, then, between these two kinds of rule, of ruling and being ruled, ultimately lies at the heart of political disorder. And the task, then, in the same way that a human being is to, be self-sufficient, continue being at work, staying itself, the same is the case with politics. The point of politics, then, is to sustain the city, to sustain the community, to sustain the individual, while at the same time enabling them to flourish, to reach their potential, to fulfill their purpose as a human being. So I think a very important question to consider as we read the rest of the Politics is, are Aristotle's arguments regarding natural slavery and sexism necessary for his political theory, or can they be dismissed while keeping the crux of his theory intact? So again, this will be something to consider as we read the rest of some of the main parts of the Politics. Whereas next we will turn to what actually the purpose of politics is, and how we know what that purpose of politics is, and what are the better and worse ways in achieving the end or purpose of politics.